So after having reviewed The Human Condition Part 1, I've decided to revise the method at which I actually structure these videos and the way in which I actually approach them as a whole. So this video is actually going to be on just the scientific perspective, and it may take another 2 videos to get to the end point on all of that. Once done, I will actually move on to the religious, hermetic and spiritual ideas of creation and um, essentially build up to the history, which will then be the videos after that, and talking about the history of the human race, all the way up to the current predicament we find ourselves in, and then discuss that actual predicament itself to kind of finish off the series. Once that's done, as I'm writing all of this information up in a even more structured format than these videos will be in, I'm going to make those available, those documents for people to actually download. So in the interim, I'll just be focusing on the videos and writing the stuff on the side, and then once all of the videos in this series are done, I'll make that documentation actually available, and then I'll move on to the next series, which will be going back probably to Hermeticism and various aspects of occultic doctrine and so on and so forth. So to begin with, I'm going to discuss the physical evolution, in which the 4 fundamental forces and the building blocks of all things material and held within this universe were created, and the basic interactions that began, leading to the perpetuation of evolution, if you will, into the chemical evolution. I will also start off on the biological evolution, but I'm conscious that to get to the end of all of this information I have planned, it may take, as I say, 2 videos, maybe even 3. Um, so the universe, as scientists see it, was created by a Big Bang. Now, we don't really understand much about the cause of this initial explosion of energy beyond speculation and the facts that we know about our present. However, we do know that it stemmed from a minute point in the void, which we now know as space. Inside of this infinitesimally small point, if you will, was a vast amount of dense energy subject to an incredibly high temperature and a high pressure state, which propagated, after the initial explosion, into a chain reaction of interactions between matter and antimatter, whilst expanding. Within a mere second, millions of interactions, referred to as annihilations, had already taken place, and essentially the volume of matter predominantly outweighed the volume of antimatter. Now, these annihilations are essentially the same thing as we can see within waves, in which waves do one of 2 things when meeting another wave. They either, if say for instance they are the exact same but opposite wavelength and frequency, they will actually cancel one another out, essentially flatlining. However, they may also superimpose if they are of the same wavelength and frequency, in which they will then increase the amplitude, so they will increase in volume. So this is pretty much the same as within these particles, these interactions of matter and antimatter, in which essentially what happened was they gave out some form of radiation after colliding and cancelling one another out. So at this point, the universe was also exponentially inflating, and obviously it's continually expanded ever since, whilst the temperature and the density began to decrease, with particles losing momentum and interactions slowing. However, compared to what we see as speed nowadays, we wouldn't see these considered slow, by our standards at the least. So gravity and the other fundamental forces, totaling 4, which consisted of strong nuclear, weak intermolecular, and electromagnetism, in addition to gravity, all came into play at this point in time. So sometime during the initial Big Bang itself, whilst the cooling process continued, and many of the cosmic celestial bodies began to form from the increasingly complex atoms which would have been created from the interaction and union of subatomic particles, which are of course governed by strong nuclear forces and electromagnetism. Now, the majority of the information we have on these processes, whilst incredibly accurate when compared with our ancient ancestors' understandings of the actual physical nature, the physical mechanisms of this creation, is still based on theoretical studies. So, as I'm not a physicist, I'm not going to postulate too much further on the nitty gritty. However, I may come back to these at a later point in time. That being said, The Big Bang was over in minutes, though it took much longer for many of the after effects, such as the creation of galaxies, stars, and planets, to take place. These effects are still taking place to this very day, and the fundamental principles still governing the laws of our reality and nature being the mechanisms for more complicated forms of life, if you will, to take form. So, the very solar system which we call our home today was only created roughly 4.5 billion years ago, whilst the Big Bang had taken place at least 13 billion years ago, and scientists reckon that it's actually closer to 14 billion years, but the dates are obviously a little bit difficult to truly ascertain. Um, and the solar system itself was caused by the formation of elements comprised of an atomic structure of protons, neutrons, and electrons in various different volumes. So, our sun consists of hydrogen and helium primarily, which are the lightest of the elements that we know of. More dense elements subsequently form the planets which orbit it, and the structure of the Earth is similar in fashion to a much smaller sun, the core of which being responsible for producing many of the resources, such as iron and other metals, as well as minerals, which we rely so heavily on. And this core acted as a generator for fusion reactions, the same as the sun, making these minerals, metals, and so on and so forth available in the mantle and crust. So, at the point at which the cosmos was beginning to be formed from this initial instance, this initial physical evolution, in which matter was beginning to make slightly more complex forms of matter. So we went from very basic building blocks to the atomic structure, and then to elements themselves, so atoms, of varying different complexities. That was all physical evolution, along with the development and the generation of fundamental forces. The consequence of building more and more complicated materials, if you will, is where chemical evolution began. And this is essentially the more complicated interactions between matter and antimatter in relation to the fundamental forces, resulting in reactions that created interplay between various elements, creating molecules. Now, these could either be compounds or mixtures, compounds being elements of the same. So, for instance, oxygen is composed of two oxygen atoms via covalent bonding, and mixtures essentially being comprised of multiple different elements. So carbon dioxide, for instance, consists of carbon with 2 parts oxygen. So this interplay between these elements creating these molecules essentially resulted in more complex variation of the properties of physical materials. So the way carbon behaves in various different molecules will actually be dependent on what molecules it's bonded with. So the data required for the precursors of life to begin, on the planet was made available by comet and meteor showers that brought amino acids and other essential precursor molecules to the Earth during the time that the atmosphere had no free oxygen and was mostly comprised of carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide. So, in essence, the Earth was actually terraformed by these meteor and comet showers. Now, the atmospheric constituents were essentially the breath of the planet. Volcanic compounds were spewing forth from the many openings in the Earth's crust at that particular time. As the Earth is still technically a form of life, though not recognised as life in the same way that an animal, plant, or bacteria is, it's essentially in a different classification. So all of this data was made available actually from external sources, from parts of the cosmos that were potentially already well substantiated in terms of its development, varying different compounds being way more complex than anything that was on Earth at the time. So we aren't exactly sure which preceded, whether it was genetics or metabolism, though both Haldane and Oparin in 1924 convergently came to the conclusion that an organic soup existed, in which the process of biopoiesis, which is the process of living matter evolving from self-replicating but non-living molecules, led to the formation of cells, which to me actually implies primitive metabolism created the requirements for genetic material, and then advanced metabolism was propagated from there. However, protoplasm was the actual first living thing, though it was similar to viruses in that it can't really be referred to as living. It was a very simple form consisting of a membrane enclosing cytoplasmic fluids, with very basic organelles and nuclear genetic data. So this is really where biological evolution began. Chemical evolution resulted in variations to elements that were indistinct of one another at the base level, but in different arrangements and volumes resulted in yet more complicated generation, thus resulting in observably different behaviours and material possibilities to occur within physical material. So the arrival of amino acids, for instance, on the Earth, the creation of phospholipids, so on and so forth, actually led to this protoplasm. So now I'm going to actually discuss how that actually came to be. So cell membranes were created from the natural tendency of phospholipids to have the phosphorus portion or head facing liquid, as it's hydrophilic, meaning loving of water, if you will, whilst the tails were consisting of fatty acids and are hydrophobic, afraid of water. Is that what that translates to as roughly? So as a result of this, a bilayer formed, engulfing some of this primordial soup, containing the essential metabolites, the monomers, if you will, of sugars, proteins, and fats, which would act as building blocks to future development of life as we know it. So all of these materials have been developed from various chemical reactions within this primordial soup, this broth, that would have been quite high temperature due to the atmospheric nature of the Earth at the time, as well as volcanic activity creating a lot of heat. And because of this arrival of this data, if you will, from comet and meteor showers, this was also inside of this broth, this primordial soup. So with these cell membranes now separating this broth to a cytoplasmic and a non-cytoplasmic fluid, so in reality there was no difference between these two fluids. One was just held within a bilayer, this membrane, and the rest of it was just surrounding this membrane. This is what resulted in essentially the separation of what would become living material and what was non-living material, but contained all of the requirements for it. So, as we understand it today, cell membranes allow for molecules to both leave and enter through a process known as cytosis, though it is known specifically as endocytosis when molecules enter and exocytosis when they leave. This results in the splitting of the cell membrane as well, without undermining the nature of the hydrophobic and hydrophilic nature, as encapsulation and subsequent splitting and reformation of the cell membrane directly facilitates the ability of a cell in movement of molecules into and out of the cell. It's this process that allows cell division to occur without exposing the internal components of the cell to external influence, if you will. So, as a result of this, essentially what happens is the membrane itself can actually wrap around itself internally and then separate out into two parts, or and that can be of varying different sizes. So, say for instance, it wants to take in molecules. Stimuli of molecules at the border, the boundary of the external part of the cell membrane will result in a vesicle, as it's referred to as, forming, in which the molecules will be allowed into an indentation which is made by the cell membrane. And then, because at no point the cell membrane allows any part of the molecules or whatnot to actually touch this external liquid anymore, it doesn't allow this external liquid to kind of pour in at all. What happens is that it can encapsulate around things, and then this can enter into the cell in this small version of the cell membrane, and of course the cell membrane can then build itself bigger as well in modern cells anyway. Obviously cells back then would have been slightly different, but they would have still worked in much the same way. So RNA was essentially the first form of genetic data, and it's still utilised inside of cells to this day in the process of transcription and translation, though the former point is still in dispute, though popularly accepted, as the RNA world hypothesis is where that segment of information comes from. And these processes of transcription and translation are what allow us to create proteins, and at the time they would have allowed for a template for continued development to occur once it came into being, is the general gist of the hypothesis. Now, much of this sounds random. However, the reality is that only through trial and error did these aforementioned molecules not only come into existence, but also their symbiosis into the primitive cells that would later come to not only allow for the development of life, but also the continuation and advancement of life. So essentially, it would have taken many different attempts, and probably failed attempts, before these molecules actually became common. Once the template had kind of worked, then cell division, this splitting, would have allowed this data to be propagated further and further. And so the combination of cell membranes and these templates for creating proteins and various other molecules through that would have then become more commonplace. So RNA, as we know it, consists of nitrogenous base pairs, adenine, guanine, uracil in place of thymine, which is found in DNA, and cytosine. So in addition, it also contains a 5-carbon sugar and also a phosphate molecule. So we don't know whether the primitive RNA abided by the same structure, but as with most of the above, this is the best understanding we have from the scientific viewpoint. Now, this RNA would have been capable of bonding with other bases, resulting in basic cells having the ability to store a template for the creation of more complicated molecules that could perform various functions, though even this aspect would have undergone chemical evolution over the course of history. These RNA molecules could now split and replicate. So the cell membrane can split and replicate itself, and so can the RNA molecules. With a template for development and the ability for the primitive cells to split in much the same way as they still do today, it is postulated that this is what resulted in the continuation and, over time, further development of the cell biochemistry and genetics. Whilst many possibilities could have occurred, they didn't, and therefore we cannot be sure that there wasn't a better, more capable form for life on this planet to be based off of. Nonetheless, the laws of nature or reality led to this path being followed, and only time will tell if nature got it right. However, all of that being said, it was cyanobacterium, a bacterium capable of photosynthesizing, that led to the gradual increase in free oxygen, or perhaps a more primitive form of cyanobacterium. And only once this had occurred was there a possibility for more advanced life forms to take place on this planet, as oxygen is crucial to almost all forms of life, being crucial to thermodynamics on Earth, as well as being an absolute requirement for the many forms of life that exist to this day. So RNA most likely would have been capable of doing the same things that it does today. In essence, it would have been capable of joining amino acids together, as well as catalyzing certain reactions. But obviously the main point with regards to the RNA world hypothesis is that RNA, as it was unstable, would have eventually led to DNA. Now, as previously mentioned, the RNA would have been capable of replication due to the fact that it could also bond with base pairs, which would have created copies of the RNA. As a result of that, with the cytoplasm and the cell membranes being able to split and encapsulate be encapsulated, the RNA would have separated out and would have been encapsulated as well. Hence why primitive cells would have been capable of splitting. So for this reason, proteins in very basic forms, merely as amino acids, because complex proteins would not have been required in these primitive cells. Amino acids would have done the majority of the work that proteins today do. However, because they're unicellular and they are primitive, they wouldn't have needed as complicated amino acids or proteins to be involved. So DNA is most likely to have evolved through necessity, as necessity is the mother of all invention. The requirement for greater storage of molecular information is likely to have been the driving force, this necessity that I'm speaking of, as it possesses the ability to become condensed due to a variety of mechanisms which are not possible with RNA. So DNA is also comprised of a 5-carbon sugar, though it is a different pentose to RNA, i.e. a 5-sided sugar, or 5-carbon sugar if you will, and also possesses the phosphate molecule. The 4 nitrogenous bases that are attached are only different with regards to uracil being replaced by thymine, and they still form base pairs, though in this case the purpose is twofold. Weak intermolecular forces are responsible for the formation of the double helix strand that is most probably the most iconic aspect of the molecule. Disulfide bridges, van der Waals forces, and hydrogen bonding, as well as covalent bonding, are all involved in holding the molecule together. Though the two most important are hydrogen and covalent bonding, which are, again, all governed by the intermolecular forces, the weak ones. So the hydrogen bonds are responsible for the base pairing between the two strands, and are not particularly strong, which plays a part in transcription and mitosis and meiosis. Whilst the covalent bonds result in the sugar phosphate backbone consisting of a chain of these sugar phosphates, each monomeric unit having a base pair attached, and they're relatively strong and stable. The other weak intermolecular force-based bonds are involved in the formation of the helical nature of DNA, which further strengthens and stabilizes the molecule. So, chromosome formation occurs through condensing of the helixes via the use of histones, which are a group of proteins that bind to the helices and fold them up, further increasing the stability and reducing the surface area, in addition to preventing external factors from changing the molecule. So in other words, they reduce reactivity, or the likelihood of reactions occurring when they're not wanted anyway. So these factors result in DNA being far more stable than RNA, and also result in the molecule being able to be much larger without requiring additional cellular space, though RNA is typically a lot smaller than DNA even when fully condensed. As is the same with RNA, DNA also base pairs for the purpose of replication. However, the process known as transcription is only the first phase of protein synthesis, and occurs when the DNA helix is first uncondensed and then unwound, though it is only ever unwound where it is being worked on by the enzymes responsible for transcription, such as DNA helicase and various ligases. These processes are governed by enzymes, and once unwound, a form of RNA known as mRNA is produced as a direct reverse copy of the original DNA code, though mRNA is only ever produced as a single gene's code. And genes can be much longer than, for instance, typical amino acids, which would be the resultant of the mRNA being translated. So this translation process, amino acids essentially would have been shorter back in the days when RNA was the main genetic data. So this mRNA then leaves the nucleus through the nuclear membrane and binds to ribosomes in the cytoplasm. Once bound, another form of RNA called tRNA, or translational RNA, binds to the mRNA's code based on the original copy from the DNA, and there's amino acids attached to it. Though the RNA always has uracil in place of thymine, regardless of whether it's in the cytoplasm or whether it's in the nuclear membrane. So once the entire mRNA, the messenger RNA code, has a corresponding tRNA bound to it within the ribosome, which are controlled by rRNAs or ribosomal RNAs, enzymes bind the amino acids together, resulting in a polypeptide, which will then break off and head to the other organelles in the cell, before either leaving the cell or being utilized within the cell. The process that I'm discussing is actually more complicated than this, but the bare bones should suffice for the purposes of this particular discussion. So the key element of genetic data is that it undergoes expression to allow for the creation of all protein-based molecules in the body, i.e. hormone production or precursors to them, enzymes which are utilized to break down food and extract energy in the form of ATP and NADH, precursors for glycoconjugates, which are structure and communicative saccharides, which also includes some elements of hormones, lectins, which are receptors for glycoconjugates, and so on and so forth. And when not being expressed, this genetic data is compacted and easily stored, with little to no reactivity in its condensed form, and keeps the high volumes of information encoded within as secure as possible, though mutations do still occur from time to time, which of course is important for the purposes of biological evolution, though not always good for the individual. So mitosis is the process for standard cell division and replication, and essentially copies the genetic data, though the integrity is not always maintained. This consists of a number of phases, but I will not delve into this too deeply for now, as it is not inherently required at this point in time. Meiosis is the process of cell division that is specific to the creation of gametes, or sperms and eggs, and is the method by which cells can halve the genetic constituency for the purposes of genetic shuffling, which results in variation within eukaryotic organisms. once a zygote is formed from the union of the two types of gamete. Again, I will not dwell on mitosis or meiosis at this point in time, as I am merely explaining how biological evolution occurred. There are two types of cell in the modern world that we are aware of, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Viruses are an exception to this, but they're not really classified as cells due to their even more primitive nature. Prokaryotic cells are very basic when compared to eukaryotic cells. The genetic data is not condensed and enveloped in the nuclear membrane. Instead, it floats within the cellular cytoplasm freely, and their chromosomes are singular rather than paired. They possess no membrane-bound organelles, though they possess many of the same organelles that eukaryotic cells do. Also, such as ribosomes for protein synthesis, cell membranes for transportation, communication, and replication, cell walls in the case of similarity to plants, or plant cells I should say, though they're not made of cellulose, which protect the cell and help structurally, and cytoplasm, which holds molecules for cellular operations. Bacteria and archaea fall into this category, and it is important to note that replication is not achieved in the same manner as in eukaryotic cells, as they do so without undergoing the process of mitosis. Eukaryotic cells contain chromosomes that are paired and are condensed and encased within a nuclear membrane. They contain other membrane-bound organelles, as well as ribosomes, cytoplasm, cell membranes, and cell walls, though cell walls aren't contained in all eukaryotic cells, as animals, for instance, don't carry cell walls within their cells. Mitochondria and chloroplasts also exist in eukaryotic cells, though plants contain both, animals only contain the former, which facilitate reactions involving metabolism. Interestingly, prokaryotes achieve their metabolic reactions in the cell membrane and cytoplasm without the need for most of these organelles. So, mitochondria, involved in the generation of energy within present-day cells, are believed to have actually originated from a process known as phagocytosis, in which whole cells are absorbed into and by another cell. A primitive ancestor of eukaryotic cells are believed to have engulfed a cell that had developed the trait of generating high-energy molecules for releasing energy, in this case adenosine triphosphate, aka ATP, and would have greatly benefited from this interaction, as energy created by this precursor life form on behalf of its host would have allowed for mutually beneficial exchanges, whereby the host would provide the building blocks and a shelter, if you will, whilst it could provide energy for greater numbers of reactions. As genetic data had already begun undergoing chemical evolution, this is believed to be the reason as to why we have mitochondrial DNA in addition to nuclear DNA. Life feeds on life, as they say. It's also likely that chloroplasts in photosynthesizing life forms formed from a similar interaction, most likely something similar to the primitive cyanobacterium already mentioned, though plants, for instance, also contain mitochondria, which are utilized in conjunction with the chloroplasts for the cellular processes of photosynthesis and respiration. Animal cells only typically have respiration as a process that they undergo out of the aforementioned. And these essentially interlink in the case of plants, allowing for the generation of oxygen via the breaking down of carbon dioxide and water produced through respiration, which results in glucose also being created for the plant to use as food. Again, it's more complicated than this, as there are a large number of intermediates involved as per Hess's cycle, in which the mechanisms of a reaction are independent of the route it takes, provided the same reactants and products are used, i.e. the reaction has many steps, and the typically used explanations of these processes only focuses on the input and output, hence why I've broken it down into oxygen being generated alongside of glucose through the breaking down of carbon dioxide and water, which is essentially in England what is referred to as GCSE level, rather than A level and degree level, in which there's oxidative phosphorylation and Krebs and Calvin cycles and so on and so forth involved, which mean that it's got well over 40 steps, probably more, in terms of the actual energy production side of things, and before you get the products from the reactants. Now, bearing in mind all of the aforementioned, there are unicellular eukaryotic organisms. However, the main purpose for the development of eukaryotic cells appears to lie in the potential for greater variance within nature and the continuance of this cosmic experiment, which appears to have been directly facilitated by the evolution of multicellular organisms. Now, in order for these organisms to generate this variance, the cells utilise meiosis, which shuffles the combinations of genes and results in direct offspring, i.e. those produced by two other members of the same species, having completely different morphologies to their parents, though still inheriting some of the traits. So when humans mate, half of the chromosomes are provided by each partner, resulting in the formation of a zygote from two distinct gametes, i.e. the sperm and egg. The egg provides a huge store of metabolic energy so that the initial reactions can take place whilst the formation of placenta and such occurs, and division occurs where 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and 4 becomes 8, i.e. as in the aforementioned process of meiosis. Of course, environmental stimuli have an effect on the genetic composition of all organisms, but multicellular eukaryotic organisms have a greater degree of variance due to many factors, some being purely genetic, which is essentially a mix of chemical and biological intervention, such as mutation, some being linked to the direct chemical interference, which can also result in mutation. Radiation is also a possibility, also potentially causing mutations. Selective pressures such as disease, susceptibility, and so on. And in the case of more evolved species, behaviour can also have an impact, which can also be linked to the aforementioned as well as a great many other possible causes, such as premature death and not producing offspring, and thus propagating the genetic composition that you contain as an individual. So, once the eukaryotic cells and their functions were generated, the possibility for multicellular organisms began, and I'm not going to dwell on this or any of the aforementioned in any greater detail at this point. Some will be expanded upon later in the series, though some may be explained in later series. Same with epigenetics, that will be later on within this particular series. So, I will say, however, that all of these organisms have become further adapted over time, and some have gone extinct due to not being able to react or adapt to the constantly evolving world we live in. Every organism needs a niche, needs an unparalleled purpose where there is only enough competition for the most successful aspects of their being to thrive, but regardless, competition is needed, as per the laws explained in Darwin and many other works regarding natural selection. The most important aspect to keep in mind when looking at biological life, and indeed everything made of matter, is that form defines function, which leads to specialization and occurs due to selection and the ensuing adaptations. Many animals share homogeneous traits, such as whales, bats, humans, and indeed most mammals, due to nature building on already tried and tested structures and templates, as form-function relationship occurs at every level of the universe, in keeping with the Hermetic laws of correspondence. These underlying morphological traits derived from an original precursor, acting as a template and propagated throughout a wide variety of entities, are a key element in the theory of evolution, as it shows that many species are linked by common ancestors. Of course, the reason that these morphologies or adaptations develop were due to a requirement in most cases, almost like the principles of nature were being driven towards a specific end. However, it doesn't seem a stretch of the imagination to come to the realization that life could have reached a stable point and stopped advancing, but much like the continual expansion of the universe, it didn't and hasn't as of yet. It's also important to bear in mind that natural selection is the only really relevant part of the origin of species, as Darwin has pretty much been found to be incorrect on many of his other proposals at this point. Though we have not seen any examples of macroevolution, we have seen large volumes of microevolutionary adaptations, which when observed from the present day imply macroevolution. Something which I personally deem a misnomer, as microevolutionary changes can result in extreme phenotypic differentiation, i.e. expressive, physically expressed differentiation, thus being viewed as macroevolution. Though this is not to say that macroevolution is not a thing, it merely means that as of yet we have not seen any real examples backed up by true empirical evidence, in whatever form it may take, as of yet anyway. However, I will refer back to all of this latter part of this section much later on, as this does tie in with some more of the hermetic and religious aspects. So I'm going to leave this video where it is at the moment, and then continue with it in the next video, which hopefully will be up next weekend. So just to kind of conclude with the contents of this video, the main aim is essentially just to portray how science views the creation of life, as well as non-life, from the very beginning to the point at which biological evolution had reached a point at which we were being created. So essentially outlining physical evolution led to chemical evolution, which in turn led to biological evolution, and then biological evolution, much the same with the aforementioned, is still ongoing. However, biological evolution still builds upon what chemical evolution built upon from physical evolution. So this is all purely from the scientific perspective, and I personally don't believe anything I read, anything I come across, simply because of the fact that the majority, for instance, of the stuff discussed today in this video is hypothetical. We know a lot, but we don't know how much of that is necessarily true. Now, what I will say is that there is a lot of empirical evidence to back up and support everything that's been discussed. But that being said, I will delve deeper into this in the texts that I'm writing, as well as in later series potentially. So the next video will continue from where we've left off, and we'll start discussing human origins, and then moving into the religious aspects of what's already been discussed before moving on into human history, as mentioned in the introduction. So if there's anything that you disagree with, or if you think is misinforming within what I've discussed, please let me know, and I'll address it accordingly. And let me know what you think if you feel so inclined. Okay, thanks.